The title of this presentation is Purification and the Higher Spiritual Path. My name is Wilson Quinn. There is a higher path for the resolute spiritual wayfarer that includes probation for chelaship under the supervision of an adept, also referred to as masters or mahatmas. If successful, becoming one of their accepted chelas, the Sanskrit term meaning disciple or pupil, may ultimately lead the wayfarer to initiation into that ancient order of which these adepts and their senior chelas are members. These adepts and their order have accompanied humankind on its evolutionary journey since time immemorial, and are the spiritually advanced teachers of all those who choose to serve humanity throughout its spiritual evolution. They are also guardians of the esoteric knowledge and secrets which, among other things, form the curriculum of what the junior and senior chelas learned within their order. But complete mental and physical purity are absolute prerequisites, both to continue ascending the higher spiritual path and to win the right to interact and collaborate with these initiates and adepts. It is of no use either to deny or to defend the fact that the adepts and other high initiates of their ancient order to which the adept Kuthumi and his brother Moria belong are extraordinarily reclusive. Being so reclusive, they are, accordingly, equally reticent to interact with the transient world and its inhabitants. It is therefore pointless to seek to deny or defend these attributes because their admitted and self-described reclusivity and reticence are undeniable and, moreover, are in no need of being defended. In line with these preferences, the adept Kuthumi also declared that the motto of his order is, quote, to dare, to will, to act, and to remain silent, end quote. It is pursuant to these aggregated facts of reclusivity, reticence, and silence that HPB, the higher and initiated Chela of Moria, says of the initiates of this order that, quote, no true adept will on any consideration whatever reveal himself as one to the profane, end quote. While this order does have strict or adamantine laws and rules, which the adepts repeatedly emphasize in their writings, reclusivity and reticence are not de jure requirements among these rules. Rather, reclusivity and reticence are de facto necessities based on certain basic principles of sacred science, which are neither judgmental nor biased. These principles often manifest as natural phenomena, such as sympathetic vibration. Moreover, we know through their writings that organizationally, this ancient and venerable order is hierarchical, and that the hierarchy of its initiate members is based on criteria such as seniority, mastery of will force, degrees of initiation attained, wisdom, and compassion, among others. We also learn from their writings that the higher initiate in this order, the greater the reclusivity and reticence he or she may need to adopt for interactions with the transient world. As Kutumi tells us, quote, "The greater the powers of the adept, the less he is in sympathy with the natures of the profane, who often come to him saturated with the emanations of the outside world, those animal emanations of the selfish, brutal crowd that we so dread. The longer he was separated from that world, the purer he has himself become." End quote. But though the adepts are reluctant to enter the world of the brutal crowd, they often allow their advanced chelas to work in the world on their behalf as their agents to further their primary mission of the enlightenment of humanity. In speaking about leaving their chelas to fight their own battles until they are qualified to serve as their agents working in the world, Kutumi wrote that adepts may have to show such restraint, occasionally, even with higher and initiated chelas, such as HPB, once they are allowed to work in the world that all of us more or less avoid. End quote. Such statements of avoidance, of reclusivity and reticence, appear in multiple places in the writings of these adepts, and no attempts to hide or deny these self-described and clearly admitted preferences were ever made by them. "Our ways are not your ways," wrote Kutumi to his Chela, Laura Holloway. Quote, "We rarely show any outward signs by which to be recognized or sensed." End quote. Elsewhere, Kutumi wrote to A.O. Hume, quote, "Be it as it may, we are content to live as we do, unknown and undisturbed by a civilization which rests so exclusively upon intellect or manas." End quote. Yet these discretionary preferences and behaviors of reclusivity and reticence by the adepts and high initiates are neither arbitrary nor capricious. As was mentioned above, there are sound metaphysical or sacred science reasons for them based on the adepts' extraordinary levels of physical and psychic purification, brought about by advanced levels of spiritual development. In addition to sympathetic vibration and the law of correspondence, these sacred scientific reasons also have to do with the efficiency of the expenditure of their spiritual energy, working within an unpolluted psychic environment that is conducive to producing the very best results, and with avoiding the need to constantly guard or protect themselves in the conduct of this work. As Moria forcefully stated, quote, "Please realize the fact that so long as men doubt our existence, there will be curiosity and inquiry. But let our secret be once thoroughly vulgarized, and not only will skeptical society derive no great good, but our privacy would be constantly endangered and have to be continually guarded at an unreasonable cost of power." End quote. One need only conjure a mental image of today's aggressive paparazzi mercilessly harassing celebrities and those in the news to acknowledge the truth of this assertion. Stated succinctly, among the foremost reasons for the reclusivity reticence, and silence of the adepts and high initiates of the order is to ensure the efficiency and efficacy of results of the work they do for humanity, primarily through their spiritual powers. None of this work can be done efficiently while expending an unreasonable cost of power to fend off avaricious and selfish curiosity, as Moria declared. And this strict conservation of spiritual energy is more than a consensus view of an obvious truth. It is a rule of their order, stated in these terms and emphasized by Kuthumi, who wrote of, quote, the rule that forbids our using one minimum of power until every ordinary means has been tried and failed, end quote. Inextricably related to the need for the highest efficiency and efficacy of their labors, achievable in their pristine, isolated environments, like the flip side of the same coin, is the added difficulty for highly purified adepts to work in the mire and psychic pollution of the transient world they prefer to avoid. It is not that they are unable to do this, but more that they are unwilling for cogent and justifiable reasons. One need only imagine a championship swimmer who swims quickly across a mountain lake of the purest water when, upon re-entering the lake to swim back, he finds its contents have mysteriously turned into thick sugarcane molasses. How quick or efficient, by comparison, would be his return swim in those conditions? And how much greater an expenditure of energy would be needed on the return swim? This aquatic physical metaphor has a metaphysical correspondence, being the purified adept laboring in the toxic psychic miasma of the transient world, as described in what follows by HPB, who minces no words. Quote, sometimes, under very favorable conditions, they, the adepts, may approach an individual devoted to occult research. But this happens rarely, for even he, pure though he be, is wallowing in the world's corrupt akasha or magnetic aura and contaminated by it. To the adept's inner self, it is as stifling and deadly as the heavy vapor of carbonic oxide to his physical lungs. And remember, it is by the inner, not the outer self, that we come into relations with the adepts and their advanced chelas. One would not expect to hold improving conversation with a besotted inebriate lying in a state of swine-like stupefaction after a debauch. Yet it is quite as impracticable for the spiritualized Mahatma to exchange thoughts with a man of society living daily in a state of psychic intoxication among the magnetic fumes of its carnality, materialism, and spiritual atrophy. End quote. If this description by HPB is insufficient to convince anyone who would question it, any such doubts should be assuaged by a first-hand account of an adept. Kuthumi retired from the outer world for several months in the years 1881 and 82 to take another advanced initiation, referred to by Moria as entering Tongpa Nyi, a Tibetan term for void, in a remote location in the Himalayas. After returning to his former labors around March of 1882 in a highly purified state, he found the readjustment painful. He wrote that, quote, "Since my return, I found it impossible for me to even breathe, even in the atmosphere of the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Adyar, India. Moria had to interfere and to force the whole household to give up meat. And they had, all of them, to be purified and thoroughly cleansed with various disinfecting drugs before I could even help myself to my letters." End quote. Given the reclusivity, reticence, and silence they usually observe, and the distance they prefer to keep from psychic pollution, all in order to do their work with maximum efficiency and efficacy, adepts should not be made to suffer the strain of sacrificing these preferences in order to train chelas. Yet at times they do. When that occurs, what then do chelas owe in return? If the first duty of a probationer or newly accepted chela ascending the higher spiritual path could be reduced to a single word, that word might well be purification. This is because a sort of chasm exists between the purified and spiritualized environment within which the adepts live and work, and the correspondingly lower or denser environments of the transient world in which the probationer or newly accepted chela typically lives, even if within an ashram or a monastery. Putting aside momentarily the delicate process of synchronizing the personal electromagnetic emanations or frequencies between guru and chela, it should not be for the adept to have to adapt to the lower environment or world of the chela. It should be for the probationer or newly accepted chela to strive in adapting to the higher spiritualized environment of the adept and other high initiates. And this is done by a conscious, unremitting, and resolute process of purification, leading to a refinement of his or her electromagnetic energies. Kutumi stated simply that, quote, "We invariably welcome the newcomer. Only, instead of going over to him, he has to come over to us," end quote. To come to us is another way of saying that the chela must become fit or qualified for entry into that higher psychic environment by attuning his or her spiritual magnetic emanations to those of the adepts and their world. Especially in these ominous times, this is not an easy task. While this process of spiritual purification can be described as a task, it is more than that. It is a law or duty inherent in the time-honored tradition of the guru-chela relationship at this level of higher spiritual development. HBB cites the laws of Vipassana or chelaship. Quote, "From Book 4 of QT, chapter on the laws of Vipassana, we learned that the qualifications expected in a chela were 1, perfect physical health, and 2, absolute mental and physical purity," end quote. On the higher spiritual path, this process of absolute purity or purification has 2 discrete modes. that which should be acquired and integrated by the wayfarer, and that which should be avoided. As to the first of these modes, or those virtues to be acquired, Kuthumi listed basic practices that further the process of purification, which have been undertaken by spiritual aspirants since time immemorial. Quote, fasting, meditation, chastity of thought, word, and deed, silence for certain periods of time to enable nature herself to speak to him who comes to her for information. Government of the animal passions and impulses. Utter unselfishness of intention. The use of certain incense and fumigations for physiological purposes. End quote. More can certainly be added to this list of largely physical purification practices, such as following a plant-based diet, daily exercise, proper hygiene, and a regimen of hatha yoga, including both normal asanas and the cleansing practices known as shatkarmas, which consist of 6 whole-body techniques. For guidance in undertaking a corresponding regimen of absolute mental purification, the most accessible for the wayfarer are the profound initiatic rules set forth in the 1885 book by Mabel Collins, entitled Light on the Path. As to the second of these modes, or that which should be avoided, the list is even longer, especially for those living in the West. For the wayfarer on the higher spiritual path, the process of physical purification includes avoidance of the basic somatic distractions, such as poor diet and or habitual overeating, sexual misconduct, if not sexual relations altogether, and the use of intoxicants like alcohol and drugs, such as opiates, that constrict or contract the consciousness. One might also add here the avoidance of all related addictions or addictive behaviors that affect the body in a deleterious way. By contrast, avoiding the psychic impediments to absolute mental purity is generally more difficult for the wayfarer than avoiding profligate physical behaviors. These impediments include, in the words of Kuthumi, quote, furies called doubt, skepticism, scorn, ridicule, envy, and finally temptation, especially the latter, end quote. One could add to this list the psychic impurities of avarice, dishonesty, egotism, mendacity, and the lust for power or for recognition or fame, all of which are wholly incompatible with ascending the higher spiritual path, to say nothing of chelaship. These are the types of moral or mental human foibles that not only invariably lead one to physical activities that ought to be avoided, but they invade the mind and often haunt one's meditation as inner monologues or as dialogues with others and as vitiating daydreams. Wayfarers on this higher path have several choices for instruction and training in adopting or avoiding various behaviors in the quest for purification. One choice among these is found in Chapter 10, The Occult Hierarchy, in a book entitled Man, Fragments of Forgotten History by 2 Chelas of Kuthumi. There we learn of the 4 accomplishments needed for chelaship, being 1, right knowledge of the real and the unreal, 2, the permanent effect produced on the mind by that right knowledge. 3, the 6 qualifications listed there in their Sanskrit names. And 4, a desire for liberation from conditioned existence. Another choice is the 12 steps found in an 1888 article by HBB titled Practical Occultism, which outline a course beginning with creating a special place to undertake daily training for purification, finding a group of other disciples to train with, stilling the active mind to peace, renunciation of all the vanities of life, avoidance of magnetic influences of others, abstinence of animal foods, and the practice of meditation and loving kindness. Yet another choice is the 21 rules set forth in the introduction to HBB's ES instructions, found in volume 12 of her collected writings. While the first of these rules deal with interactions between members of the esoteric section, later rules deal with the use of intoxicants, plant-based diets, and daily meditation. Finally, one may read the letters of the adepts themselves regarding the moral training and steps toward purification, pertinent passages of which have been compiled and appear as Section 3, Qualities and Behaviors Necessary for Advancement, in a book entitled The Chela's Handbook. The 2 modes of purification, what to acquire and what to avoid, and whatever other means may be employed to effect purification, must ordinarily be applied during the wayfarer's period of probation before accepted chelaship. Probation is normally a period of 7 years, and throughout this time, the probationer must face the challenges of absolute purification on his or her own, since, as Kutumi notes, quote, until he has passed that period, we leave him to fight out his battles as best he may, end quote. The reason for this degree of reticence, once again, reaches back to the issue of a higher spiritualized environment of the adepts, which in turn impels their preference to wait until the pupil is sufficiently purified before direct interaction between guru and chela can commence. This interaction involves a sensitive process of synchronizing the personal electromagnetic frequencies or emanations between guru and chela. Quote, in each case, wrote Kutumi, the instructor has to adapt his conditions to those of the pupil. And for the adept, the strain is terrible. For to achieve success, we have to bring ourselves into a full rapport with the subject under training, end quote. It took that long, even for one of the founders of the Theosophical Society to achieve. For as Kutumi further notes, quote, Alcott's magnetism after 6 years of purification is intensely sympathetic with ours. Physically and morally is constantly becoming more and more so, end quote. For adepts, the field of subtle electromagnetic emanations surrounding an aspiring chela, his or her aura, is not an intellectual construct, but rather an empirical reality. The more pure and less polluted that aura is, the greater the chance of further interaction with the adept. But as in the case of Henry Alcott, it took at least 6 years, and that was with the constant tutelage of his guru, Moria. In most such cases, as Kutumi pointed out, quote, the process of self-purification is not the work of a moment, nor of a few months, but of years, nay, extending over a series of lives, end quote. Regarding the present state of the spiritual evolution of humanity, the conflicting impulses that guide its course are in full tension. The modern world appears to be a creature that stubbornly refuses either to save or even to help itself. Everywhere we witness dislocation, political tumult, autocratic oppression, aggression, fear, incertitude, and suffering on a vast scale. Correspondingly, a visible and ever greater mass inversion of principles and values is afoot. Too often, good now yields to evil. Truth yields to disinformation and falsehood. Sustainable stewardship yields to exploitation, and so on. These lamentable inversions come with a heavy price, which we pay in global chaos and pollution, including pandemic diseases. The wayfarer on the higher spiritual path who recognizes the immediate need is duty-bound to help reverse this trend. The most effective way for the wayfarer to accomplish this is by aligning himself or herself with the Order of Adepts and high initiates and their principles and values. And the only way this can be done is through a rigorous and sustained process of self-purification. At stake is nothing less than whether humanity will soon become so spiritually unfit as to decimate its own multiple habitats on this globe, physical and metaphysical, by refusing to yield to the evidence and probity of spiritual evolution and unconditional love. And whether humanity will be able to succeed in reversing this trend may in part depend on whether enough probationers and newly accepted chelas are of sufficient fitness or purity to join the Herculean struggle to reverse course and to move toward the light rather than away from it. If not, then among the dire consequences humanity faces is one announced by Kutumi. Quote, if for generations we have shut out the world from the knowledge of our knowledge, it is on account of its absolute unfitness. And if, notwithstanding proofs given, it still refuses yielding to evidence, then will we, at the end of this cycle, retire into solitude and our kingdom of silence once more. End quote. Thank you for your attention.